Prayer is more about changing me than about changing God. It is more about God getting my attention than me getting God's. It is more about me caring more about God than it is trying to get God to care more about me. It is more about seeking to align my will with God's than it is about seeking to bend God's will to mine. I want to suggest that this matter of turning my will toward God has maybe what we would call two levels to it, not entirely unlike two levels or two aspects of God's will itself. When we talk about God's will, it is sometimes helpful to distinguish between what God desires and what God allows. I'm not suggesting that we can always discern even between those things, and I know they overlap and they both fall under this umbrella of God's will. I know that what God allows, God has the power to change, God has the power to prevent. It could be different, and it ultimately still comes back to God. God could have done something. God could have prolonged a baby's life. He could have spared this person. And yet somehow we come back to this matter of God's will. What God desires, what God allows. Maybe two different things. I want to suggest that what God desires maybe it'll be helpful. Maybe what God desires could be likened in some regards to a destination, or maybe better yet, maybe it's not simply a destination, but it's a direction at least. What God desires is that we become more and more like Jesus in our thoughts, our actions, our attitudes. What God desires for us is that we become freed from self-centered patterns, freed from ways of responding to others that are hurtful to them, freed from ways of responding to life that are destructive to ourselves. What God desires is that we learn to love and serve like Jesus, who, though he was God, humbled himself and became a servant for us. These are all what God desires for us. That's part of God's will for us. Regardless of career, regardless of where we live, regardless of all these other lesser decisions, God's will for us is all of these things I've just mentioned and more. But then there are those things that God allows. And maybe what God allows could be likened to not the destination or the direction, but all the twists and turns, all the roadblocks and traffic jams, the accidents that we cause, the tickets that we earn, the accidents that others cause, or that maybe nobody caused, the tickets that we don't deserve. All these things that God allows, things that maybe are things that it takes to get us pointed in the right direction and moving towards those destinations of his desires for us. Or sometimes what God allows may be likened to the twists and turns and all these other things that are part of the journey in our own travels that in some mysterious way may help others to get pointed in the right direction and moving toward the destination that God desires. And we may never be able to understand all the reasons for the particulars that God allows in our life. I said there are two levels to us seeking to align our will with God's, for us being able to genuinely and sincerely utter that prayer, thy will be done. And the first level is kind of what we looked at last week. It's the level of John the Baptist when he said, he must increase and I must decrease. It's the level of perhaps Paul, as we read this morning, where he kind of looked at the big picture and said, my hope, my earnest desire is that in no circumstance will I ever be ashamed of Christ, but that in everything Christ would be highly honored in my body, whether by my life or by my death. And there are moments when we say, yes, Paul, I'm with you. There are moments when we say, yes, that's what I want my life to be. Yes, I want to have that faith in my life. I want to have that focus, that purpose in my life, that I say, God, whatever, I want my life to count for you. I want my life to bring glory and honor to you. I want your will in my life. That's kind of the foundation. That's the platform. That's the direction. That's where I want to take my stand. That's where I want to drive a stake in the ground. That's where I want to pile up a pile of stones as a monument to remember and say, yes, this is what I want my life to be. That's the blank check I want to sign. The account of my life, to put my signature down at the bottom with the amount left blank and hand it to God and say, you fill in the amount. You fill in the details. God, I want your will in my life. That's one level. And then God fills in the blank. And we say, not that. Please, God, not that. And as we go through life, God fills in more of the blank. It's a whole nother level of still coming back and saying, God, thy will be done. A lot of it comes down to trust. Not just, yes, I believe in God. But trust when life is falling apart. Trust in those hard times. Trust, as the song says, when I'm just so confused because I thought I had it right. I thought this is what you were asking me to do, and it isn't turning out. But we've got some examples in Scripture of actually living this out. Yes, we have the example of Paul, who said, my desire is that God be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. And we might step back and say, well, yeah, Paul, that's easy for you to say. But what do you know of suffering? Thank you, David. An appropriate response to that question. Paul, what do you know of suffering? Not from us, from Paul. You know, those words, whether by life or by death, come from Philippians chapter 1. The book of Philippians is a letter that Paul wrote to his friends, the church, the Christians at a town called Philippi, very dear to his heart. And he wrote that letter. He was on vacation on the beach in the Caribbean islands. And no, that's not right. Did you hear a little word in the reading that gives a clue where Paul was when he wrote that letter? He was in jail, imprisoned. When Paul signed that blank check, I'm sure that wasn't part of his will, his plan for his life. But more than once, God wrote in prison on the amount line. Beatings, scourgings, famine, hardship, stoning, being left for dead, falsely accused, run out of town. Paul knew something of suffering. And in Philippians chapter 1, as Paul is in jail writing this letter, we catch some more glimpses into his heart and into Paul's willingness to say, thy will be done in every situation. Here he is in jail, but who is he thinking about? Listen to these words as he's writing to his friends, to the Christians, the church in Philippi, including the church leaders, the deacons of the church. And his first paragraph is not, oh, I wish God would deliver me from this horrible circumstance. His first words are, every time I think of you guys, I give thanks to God. Whenever I pray, I make my request for you all with joy, for you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Jesus Christ from the first you heard it up until now. You see, our circumstances don't have to dictate our attitude. They don't have to dictate our ability to still be an encouragement to other people. Our circumstances don't dictate any of that. They don't have to dictate our perspective on what God is doing in the midst of all of this and in what God's desire for us and for other people is, and how God might even be using this circumstance to accomplish his desire. So here Paul is writing from jail. He's encouraging the church at Philippi. He says to them, I am certain that God, who began a good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ returns. He's not complaining about his own lot. He's encouraging them. Whatever you might be facing, hang in there because God is not finished yet. God started this work in you. I'm sure he's going to finish it. His plan, his purpose, his will in your life. Maybe in some measure he's preaching to himself at the same time. That's often what happens in preaching. Things find a place deep inside of us and speak to us and touch us in ways then that we can share them with confidence and conviction to others. Paul talks about God's desire for the church at Philippi, and in writing this letter, he's saying, here's my prayer for you. And I think Paul knows, he has confidence that what he's praying for them about is consistent with God's will, because Paul has spent time aligning his will with God's will. And listen to this prayer. I pray that your love will overflow more and more, that you will keep on growing in knowledge and understanding. For I want you to understand what really matters, so that you may live pure and blameless lives until the day Christ returns. May you always be filled with the fruit of your salvation, the righteous character produced in your life by Jesus Christ, for this will bring much glory and praise to God. Praying for God's will to be fulfilled in them, God's desires for them. And then comes this part. And I want you to know, verse 12, I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, as you seek to align your will with God's will, I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here, where? In prison. That everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. For everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. God has allowed this to happen, and God is using this twist and turn, this roadblock, this traffic jam. God is using this circumstance in my life to accomplish his desire in my life, in your life, in the lives of people around me. And so I can pray, thy will be done. I can say that this is my earnest prayer, my eager expectation and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or whether I die. This isn't just Paul signing his name on the check at the beginning. This is seeing what God has allowed to be filled in on that amount. And Paul's still saying, I earnestly pray that I will still have the same boldness, that I will continue to be faithful in serving Christ, that he will be honored in my life, whether by life or by death. Thy will be done. Does this mean that Paul never asked for freedom? Does this mean that Paul never prayed for anything to change in his circumstance? There's one very famous time. We read about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and the strange thing is we don't even exactly know what the circumstance was. But in 2 Corinthians 12, he talks about how that God, the way he said it, was so to keep me from becoming proud. And he says that in the context of understanding how God has revealed things to him. God has used him to be a channel of God's truth to the church. God has enabled him to see things and to know things. And he says, to keep me from being proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. Now there we have a glimpse of course, what's God's desire for Paul. It's for the life of Christ to be present in Paul's life. It's for Paul's life to reflect the character of Christ. It's for Paul to mature, for Paul to be a witness for Christ. And we don't know all the circumstances of where Paul might have been struggling with pride in his life. But understand, God allowed something. Paul called it a thorn in the flesh. He called it a messenger from Satan to torment me. And I believe it's by design that we're not given any more details than that. The suggestions have been many and numerous. Some say maybe it was Paul struggled with blindness. Others said, no, maybe it was migraines. No, maybe it was actually a person in his life who was just such an agitator. It just drove him crazy. And any number of things have been suggested. But the next verse, Paul says, 3 different times, I begged the Lord to take it away. Like we would, like we have. But each time he said, that is, God said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in the midst of weakness. So Paul came back to his point of saying, thy will be done. He says, "So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure." Now, is he exaggerating? Yes. He's not saying I enjoy the pain of life. He says, but I have a different perspective on it all. I take pleasure in my weaknesses, in the insults, hardships, persecutions, troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. A different perspective that enabled him, even in the midst of these challenges, even in the midst of whatever it was that caused him pain and torment, whether physically, whether emotionally, whether relationally, we don't know the details. And I'm glad we don't, because maybe each one of us can relate in different ways. If it said, I'm blind and I wish I could see, we say, well, I'm glad I can see. Well, that doesn't really relate to me, does it? But a thorn in the flesh, something that just causes continual pain and discomfort and seems to get in the way of life, something that would drag me down spiritually, emotionally if I let it, something that torments me. And sometimes maybe God will say, yes, I'll remove that. But in Paul's case, 3 times I begged God. And each time he said, my grace is all you need. My grace is sufficient. And Paul had a choice. And he chose to align his will with God's will and say, thy will be done. I trust your greater purpose. I trust your desires to be fulfilled in me and in those around me, even through this. I was in briefly with Mom and Dad this morning, getting morning medications and so forth just squared away, and was only there maybe about 10 minutes this morning. Tony Evans, some of you have heard him speak from Dallas, Fort Worth, I think. Heard him at Promise Keepers events years ago, and just a great speaker. He'd been reading my notes, and talking about many of the same themes. And what I heard in that brief moment, though, was this illustration he was giving of when these twists and turns come in life and we don't understand. And he was talking about a man we're familiar with in the Old Testament by the name of Joseph. A man who was 11th of 12 sons, his father's favorite. His 10 older brothers knew it and resented him for it. And one day his father gave him a gift that he never asked for. A coat of many colors. Boy, from there on, everything went downhill, didn't it? His father sent him to check on his brothers. Filled with envy, they seize their opportunity and they grab him, they tie him up, they throw him in a pit. They wanted to kill him, and finally one of the brothers convinced them into not killing him, but here comes this caravan along on their way down to Egypt, and let's at least get something out of him and not be guilty of shedding his blood. And they sold him to these travelers who took him to Egypt, and he wound up a slave in the house of Potiphar. Very honorable man. Even there, he could have retreated in self-pity, and I never deserved this, I never did anything wrong, but instead he did the best he could to serve his master. So much so that his master kept putting him in charge of more and more, until the day that he was falsely accused. Remember those accidents that are someone else's fault? Here was Joseph living with integrity. But his master's wife thought he was pretty attractive. And she tried to solicit him into sexual relationship with her, and he said no, and she grabbed him, and he tried to leave the room, and she held on to his coat, and he got away, and there she was with his coat, and she was furious that someone like him, a lowly slave, would spurn her, and so she sounded the alarm. She screamed for the guards and said, this Hebrew man came in and tried to have his way with me, and I have his coat as proof. And Joseph wound up in prison. You know how the story unfolds? While he was there, a cupbearer and a baker are there too. They had served Pharaoh, but something had gone wrong, and here they were in prison. And this one night, they each had their dream, and they're talking about these dreams. And Joseph said, well, my God's given me understanding into your dreams. And he tells them what their dreams mean. And one of them is going to be executed in a few days, and the other one's going to be restored to his position. And that's what happens. The one who is going to be restored to his position, he said, I just ask this one thing of you, that when you get back to your position, remember me. And he does, years later. Did Joseph sign up for that when he signed that check to trust God? Is that what he bargained? Is that what he signed up for? No. But wherever he was, he tried to do what was right. The day came when Pharaoh had a dream. And I believe it was the cupbearer happened to hear this dream, and they're seeing, is there anyone in the kingdom who can interpret this dream? Tell me what it means. And yeah, there was this guy back in the prison several years ago. I had a dream. He told me what it meant, and it happened just like he said, and we'll go get him. Joseph comes before Pharaoh, tells him about the dream, interprets the dream. Pharaoh lifts him to second in command in the land. That's not the end of the story. The dream was about famine that was coming. And famine came, and because God had warned Pharaoh in a dream, and because Joseph was able to interpret that dream and was able to advise that they prepare for it and they store up grain, when famine came throughout the whole region, there was grain in Egypt for themselves as well as grain to sell to others. The day came when Joseph's brothers, thinking he was probably long gone, and Joseph's father were in dire need of food, and they heard there was food in Egypt. And Jacob, the father, sent the brothers down to Egypt to try to buy grain. And there was Joseph. Recognized them, they didn't recognize him. And we'll go into all the story of how Joseph then tested them and sent them back and all this back and forth. But finally the day came when he revealed himself, and they were reconciled in a sense and invited the whole family down to Egypt where they would be cared for and be fed. And eventually Jacob died, and now his brothers think, okay, he's gonna get vengeance on us now that our father's gone. There's this beautiful statement of faith that Jacob makes as his brothers come before him and says, please have mercy on me, on us. And Joseph said, I realize that you meant this for evil, but God intended it for good and for the salvation of our family. You see, you could trace all those steps back. You can talk about Joseph being in the place where he could provide for his family because he had been in the jail, because he had been falsely accused, because he was in the house as a servant where he'd been sold as a slavery, because his brothers envied him, because his father gave him a coat he didn't even ask for. Talk about twists and turns and roadblocks and detours and traffic jams and traffic accidents that God allowed. He had a greater plan. But perhaps the greatest example of all is what we read about that happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus looked ahead at the cross, saw clearly what was coming, and prayed that prayer, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. That's not a cross to bear, to come to that point in life. That's what God longs for us, not just from us. It's not a lesser thing to think, I want to pray for God to change my circumstances and God just wants to change me. No, praying about our circumstances is praying too small. Seeking to let God get our attention, seeking to let God cultivate where we care more about Him, not trying to get Him to care more about us. We can't do that. He cares more than we could ever imagine. He always knows about us and is thinking about us. Not to try to bend His will to ours. It's okay. He wants us to make our requests known to Him. But He wants us to trust Him. He wants us to be able to come and say, Father, if it be possible, but nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a place of rest, a place of peace. Paul understood it. Peter later understood it as he wrote about it and said, so that's the example for all of us to follow. When we suffer, whatever the cause, to entrust ourselves into the care of Him who judges justly and continue to seek to do right. To trust Him. To seek to align our will with His. To find that deep place in our heart where we cry out, Father, thy will be done.